Have you ever noticed how some souls carry silence, not as peace, but as command? There are those who do not rest in the world. They organize it. Their minds are made of order, but not born from calm. Beneath the surface of precision and discipline, there is the memory of chaos. Not the chaos of disorder around them, but the chaos of powerlessness within them. It is this memory that quietly engineers the need for control. For the ENTJ, control is not vanity, it is compensation. Somewhere in the foundation of their psyche, something once proved unreliable. A promise, a parent, a world that shifted without warning. So they built themselves into the kind of presence that could never again be overthrown by uncertainty. They became stability incarnate, stronger than emotion, sharper than chance, swifter than hesitation. And yet, the paradox of this strength is that it hides its own origin. The world sees only confidence, efficiency, and leadership. They do not see the fragile beginnings, the quiet terror that shaped the discipline, the inner chaos that demanded mastery. Control, for the ENTJ, is not an expression of arrogance. It is the mind's way of keeping the universe still enough to think. Jung once wrote that what we repress becomes the unconscious architect of our behavior. The ENTJ's shadow is precisely this, the fear of collapse that drives the need for structure. Their competence is a defense, their power a ritual of containment. But the more they control, the more distant they become from the living, breathing pulse of spontaneity. They begin to replace experience with management and connection with direction. What begins as survival gradually transforms into an identity. They become the one who decides, the one who moves forward when others hesitate. And people begin to depend on them, to follow their certainty, to lean on their composure. It is here that the wound deepens. Because the more others rely on their control, the more terrified they become of losing it. Every success reinforces the prison. There is a kind of exhaustion that cannot be seen. The exhaustion of always having to hold the world together. The ENTJ may look unshakable, but within that stillness, there is a longing for something deeper than control. A longing for trust, to let go, to fall into the unknown without having to predict or prevent it. But the psyche resists, for surrender is a foreign language. To surrender feels like betrayal, to the very foundation that once kept them alive. This is the hidden wound, the inability to trust chaos, the inability to let life unfold without interference. Control becomes a sacred addiction, one that feels holy, rational, and justified. It is how the mind defends against its own vulnerability. But what Jung understood is that healing does not come from control. It comes from integration, the part of the ENTJ that they exile, the uncertain, the hesitant, the emotional, is the very part they must one day welcome back if they are to become whole. Control is an illusion of safety. It offers predictability, but at the cost of intimacy, with others and with oneself. The mind that leads cannot always listen. The soul that commands cannot always feel. And so the ENTJ drifts further from their own unconscious, mistaking distance for clarity. They seek to lead the external world, while their internal one remains ungoverned. Yet, there comes a moment in every life when control fails, a loss that no amount of logic can negotiate, a betrayal, a death, a silence that does not yield to strategy. In this moment, the ENTJ faces the shadow directly, the part of themselves that they have spent a lifetime outsmarting, the part that trembles, breaks, and needs. This is where transformation begins, though it feels at first like destruction. For it is only through the acceptance of chaos that true power is born. Control is not mastery, it is defense. Mastery begins when the self no longer fears its own undoing. The strongest force in the psyche is not domination, but alignment. The ENTJ who learns to align with uncertainty does not lose strength, they transcend it. They begin to lead not from will, but from wisdom, not from rigidity, but from presence. When they stop imposing structure on life, they begin to see that life itself is structured. Order does not need to be manufactured. It emerges when the mind is still enough to perceive it. The need to control fades, and in its place arises a deeper intelligence, the intuition of timing, the quiet knowing of what must be done and when. This is the evolution of the ENTJ, from commander to conductor, from strategist to sage. But it begins with surrender, a surrender not to others, but to the self, to the parts long denied, long hidden under achievement and discipline. The shadow is not the enemy, it is the origin. It is the proof that power once came from pain, and that pain can become purpose. Control, then, is no longer a wound. It becomes an art. The ENTJ who integrates their shadow no longer needs to lead to feel safe. They lead because they are at peace. Their power is no longer resistance, it is resonance. And in that stillness, they discover the truth Jung hinted at all along, that what you cannot control will teach you who you truly are. Some wounds are not visible, not marked on the skin, not whispered in memory. They live in the architecture of the mind, in the subtle way one measures time, energy, and presence. The ENTJ carries such a wound, hidden beneath the armor of strategy and structure, quietly shaping every thought and every action. To understand this, one must understand the nature of control, not as power, but as a shield, a psychic scaffolding erected to survive the chaos of a world that once felt unpredictable. Control begins in fear, though it rarely admits it. It is the fear of collapse, of being overlooked, of the raw unpredictability of circumstance. From this fear, patterns emerge: meticulous planning, decisive action, the constant calibration of self and environment. To the outsider, this may appear as mastery, but mastery is a surface. Beneath it lies a subtle tension, a nervous undercurrent that never fully rests. The ENTJ's mind is always awake, always surveying, always preparing. It is a mind trained to anticipate, a mind that learned early that failure cannot be trusted. And yet, the paradox of this preparedness is profound. The more one anticipates, the more one distances from the unfolding of life. The more one commands, the more one isolates. The more one masters, the more one clings to a fragile equilibrium that cannot hold the weight of the unconscious. For the ENTJ, the wound is never healed by success. It cannot be cured by achievements, accolades, or obedience from others. These are temporary solutions, illusions that offer relief but never integration. There is a moment, always inevitable, when life will confront this structure. The unpredictable emerges, and the mind trained for certainty encounters chaos it cannot contain. It could be a loss, a betrayal, an illness, or a silence so profound it shakes the foundation of identity. And in that moment, control becomes apparent for what it has always been: a response, a shield, a method of coping with vulnerability. The ENTJ feels the ground shift beneath them, and with that shift comes recognition, the realization that mastery over external forces cannot compensate for neglect of the internal. It is here, in the stillness of confrontation, that shadow work begins. The shadow is not something to be destroyed or banished. It is something to be recognized, understood, and integrated. The parts of the self that were denied, fear, doubt, fragility, desire, are the very elements that must be reconciled. The ENTJ is trained to lead, to act, to impose structure, Yet the greatest leadership begins with the willingness to witness the self without manipulation. Integration requires surrender. But surrender is not weakness. To surrender is to acknowledge the parts of oneself that have been silenced, denied, or disciplined into invisibility. It is to admit that the mind alone cannot hold the entirety of existence, that the body, the emotions, the instinctual currents of life demand attention. Surrender is a conscious decision to release the illusion that control equals safety, that certainty equals survival. It is to allow life to move, ungoverned and unbound, while one observes and participates without imposition. The process is subtle, often imperceptible. The mind trained for strategy begins to notice pauses, moments of resonance that were previously ignored. The body, long disciplined, begins to register signals without immediate response or correction. The emotions, once suppressed or redirected into action, begin to surface as guidance, not as obstacles. In this delicate dance, the ENTJ discovers that the power of restraint is not command, but alignment. That strength is not domination, but presence. That wisdom is not assertion, but understanding. There is a profound intelligence in chaos when one learns to listen. The ENTJ has spent a lifetime shaping events, directing outcomes, and predicting responses. Yet when the mind ceases its compulsion to control, it begins to perceive a different order, the order that arises naturally from engagement with reality rather than imposition upon it. Patterns emerge not from calculation, but from recognition. Connections form not from direction, but from resonance. Influence arises not from authority, but from authenticity. This is the alchemy of surrender, the transformation of fear into insight, of compulsion into choice, of rigidity into fluidity. The ENTJ learns that control is a tool, not a master, that structure is a guide, not a cage, that presence, quiet and observant, carries a force far greater than any command executed through will alone. And yet, integration is neither immediate nor painless. The shadow resists. The parts of the self that were exiled are unpredictable, raw, and unrefined. They reveal vulnerability that has been denied, longing that has been redirected, chaos that has been contained. To face these aspects is to confront the very wound that gave rise to the life of control, the hidden fracture that birthed both strength and isolation. It is here that courage becomes subtle. Not the courage to act, but the courage to feel, to witness, to let the self exist without imposition, without calculation, without armor. In this emergence, the ENTJ begins to experience the world differently. Interactions are no longer opportunities for command or manipulation. Decisions are no longer dictated solely by outcome or strategy. Influence becomes natural, not forced. Presence becomes more magnetic, not through authority, but through authenticity. The mind and the heart begin to converse in a language that had been long suppressed. A quiet dialogue that guides without coercion, teaches without judgment, and observes without interruption. Time itself begins to shift. Moments of silence, once empty and unsettling, now offer insight. Pauses are no longer gaps in productivity, but spaces of awareness. Reflection replaces reaction, and the relentless drive for perfection softens into a rhythm of attunement. The ENTJ discovers that the need to control others fades in proportion to the willingness to inhabit their own interior landscape fully, consciously, without resistance. This is the transformation of power, not the power of command, but the power of integration, not the power of imposition, but the power of presence, not the power of certainty, but the power of attunement to what is. The ENTJ, who moves through shadow, who allows the exiled parts of self to return and converse, becomes a figure of resonance rather than dominance. Their influence is quiet but undeniable, subtle yet pervasive. It is the force of someone who has faced chaos, embraced it, and discovered that life itself is the teacher, and the self itself is the lesson. And so, control is no longer a shield. It becomes an instrument of alignment. The wound that once drove fear becomes a source of wisdom. The fear of collapse transforms into an understanding of flow. The rigid mind softens without losing clarity. The strategist learns patience. The commander learns humility. And the isolated architect discovers that solitude, when embraced consciously, is a portal to insight, not a prison. In these moments, the ENTJ experiences the paradox that Jung spoke of. The path to wholeness is through the acknowledgement of what one has long denied. Strength emerges not from imposition, but from reconciliation. Order arises not from control, but from integration. And the hidden wound, once a source of fear and separation, becomes the very crucible in which transformation is forged. The mind that once sought to command everything now commands itself. The soul that once feared unpredictability now trusts in its own capacity to respond with discernment. And the body, long disciplined, finally feels the freedom of uncalculated movement, the ability to inhabit existence without perpetual vigilance. The ENTJ begins to understand that true power is invisible. It cannot be seen, measured, or imposed. It manifests in presence, in resonance, in the quiet acknowledgement of complexity. The wound does not vanish. It becomes sacred, a teacher, a guide, a reminder that control is only ever a temporary scaffolding, and that true mastery is the willingness to walk through uncertainty with awareness, grace, and integrity. And in this new alignment, the ENTJ begins to feel what has been absent for so long, not merely influence over others, but coherence within themselves. The fracture of fear is mended not by elimination, but by recognition. The exiled aspects of self are not conquered, they are invited into dialogue. And through this alchemy, the rare mind that once demanded to shape the world now shapes itself. The ENTJ has become something both familiar and extraordinary, a presence that commands not through force, but through attunement. A mind that navigates chaos not by dominance, but by understanding. A soul that is whole because it has embraced the totality of its being, shadows and all. And yet, even in this calm, there remains a quiet vigilance. For the shadow is never truly gone. It waits, not to punish, but to remind. To remind that control is temporary, that mastery is internal, and that the journey of integration is continuous. The ENTJ walks forward, not as a commander of others, but as a sovereign of the self, a figure both rare and timeless, moving through life with presence, clarity, and the subtle force of one who has made peace with the hidden wound. Some forces cannot be commanded, no matter how disciplined the mind. Time flows, emotions surge, chaos moves beneath the veneer of order. The ENTJ, who has spent a lifetime orchestrating and structuring, begins to realize that mastery over others is fleeting, that the only domain truly available is the self. In this quiet recognition lies the beginning of liberation. It is not sudden, it is not dramatic. It unfolds in the subtle awareness of choice, the realization that the compulsion to control need not dictate every motion, every thought, every breath. The shadow, once a source of fear, now speaks in whispers. It reminds that vulnerability is not weakness, that surrender is not defeat, that existence itself is a canvas of impermanence. To accept this is to open a space where power can breathe freely. The ENTJ begins to practice presence without imposition, to allow events to unfold without preemption, to observe without shaping. This is the first act of true authority, the authority that emerges from self-mastery, not external domination. Patterns reveal themselves naturally. Timing becomes instinctive. Influence arises effortlessly, not from strategy, but from alignment. What once required vigilance now flows spontaneously, guided by intuition honed through integration. Integration requires patience. The exiled parts of the self, the uncertainty, the doubt, the fear, the suppressed longing, return in fragments. They are not tamed, they are acknowledged. Each fragment is met with quiet observation, each shadow aspect allowed to exist without judgment. In this acceptance, the ENTJ discovers a new rhythm, the rhythm of balance, the rhythm of attunement, the rhythm of knowing when to act and when to remain still. Control is no longer the measure of strength. It becomes a tool of understanding. Influence is no longer an imposition. It becomes a reflection of authenticity. The mind that once dictated now listens. The strategist who once calculated now senses. The leader who once commanded now guides. And in this, the ENTJ experiences the paradoxical truth Jung often hinted at. Surrender is power, and mastery is freedom. The outer world may continue to demand structure, decisions, and leadership. But the ENTJ moves differently now. Action is no longer urgent, no longer reactive. It is intentional, measured, precise, not to dominate, but to harmonize. Presence becomes magnetic. Influence is subtle. Energy, once exhausted in perpetual vigilance, now flows through discernment and quiet confidence. The rare soul of the ENTJ, once isolated by compulsion, begins to connect through resonance. Relationships, tasks, and projects are approached without force, without imposition. The mind that feared unpredictability now trusts itself to respond with clarity. The wound that demanded control is transmuted into awareness, allowing life to unfold rather than being constrained by it. There is a liberation in this process, a liberation so profound it cannot be described in ordinary terms. It is a freedom of the interior world, a sovereignty over thought, feeling, and instinct. The ENTJ no longer seeks to bend reality to their will. They learn to move within its currents, to navigate with wisdom, to harmonize with the ebb and flow of existence. This is mastery that does not rely on authority, on force, or on compulsion. It is mastery of self. And yet, the journey does not end. The shadow waits, ever present, ever patient. It offers new lessons, new challenges, new invitations to surrender and integrate. The ENTJ continues to walk a path of conscious evolution, refining their presence, deepening their insight, and cultivating a power that is quiet, profound, and enduring. Ultimately, the ENTJ comes to understand that control was never truly theirs to wield. It was a response to chaos, a protection against uncertainty, a bridge to survival. The real power lies in letting go, in allowing life to unfold, in inhabiting oneself fully, without resistance, without fear, without the compulsion to orchestrate what is already moving in its own rhythm. In this surrender, the ENTJ discovers what has always been waiting: the integration of mind, body, and spirit, the alignment of ambition with wisdom, the transformation of fear into insight, the fusion of strength with serenity. They become not just a strategist, not just a leader, not just a master of circumstance, but a sovereign of the self. And in this sovereignty, they move through life differently. Their presence commands without demand. Their vision directs without force. Their decisions emerge from clarity rather than compulsion. The rare mind that once sought control now operates in harmony, attuned to the currents of reality and the rhythms of their own being. The hidden wound, once the source of isolation and tension, has become the crucible of power. The ENTJ has learned to carry chaos without being consumed, to act without dominating, to lead without constraining, to be fully and deeply aligned with themselves. And so the transformation is complete, yet ongoing. There is no finality in the journey, only continuous awakening. The ENTJ has moved beyond fear, beyond compulsion, beyond the need to control. They have stepped into the rare and timeless space where presence, wisdom, and authentic power converge. The world may see them as composed, confident, unstoppable, but the truth lies within. Their greatest mastery is invisible. It is the calm in the storm, the stillness that guides action, the quiet knowing that life cannot be owned, only navigated. And in this knowing, they are free. Because the ENTJ who integrates shadow, who surrenders control, who allows chaos to teach rather than threaten, has discovered a profound truth, that the mind which once feared everything it could not command, now sees everything with clarity, embraces all it cannot change, and moves through existence with the quiet authority of one who has become whole. The hidden wound has become the teacher, the shadow has become the guide, and the ENTJ, once prisoner of control, now walks as sovereign of self, a presence rare, powerful, and eternal.